This is the brave new world of WOLA webinars. This is our first experience at this. I think there's quite a few people watching that are basically just going to try and see how we do and how this works out because we're sort of making it up as we go. But this is a panel that we had planned and thought about for several weeks, and given what's happened in the country and in the world in the past 2-3 weeks, we decided to do this virtually. So my name is David Smilde. I am a senior fellow at WOLA, specializing in Venezuela. I'm also faculty at Tulane University in New Orleans, where I am right now. And moderating this panel. I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists and then just make a couple of comments. I'm going to ask them each to speak 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'm going to ask them each a question, and then we'll go to questions on Twitter, as well as, and if there's time after that, go to questions that can be asked through WebYard. Geoff Ramsey is WOLA's director for Venezuela. Has been working at WOLA now for 5 years. Before that, he worked at Insight Crime, writing about Colombia and Venezuela, and also as a consultant for the Latin America program and the Open Society Foundations. Jeremy McDermott is the executive director and co-founder of Insight Crime. Before that, he worked as a correspondent for the BBC, for the Daily Telegraph, and the Economist. Bram Ebus is from Holland. He holds an MA in global criminology. And has worked as a consultant for the International Crisis Group and other NGOs, and is also for a variety of international media. He was the lead journalist in an award-winning production on Venezuelan mining. Now, some of you will be disappointed to see that Veronica Zubillaga is not with us. Our original invites had her with us, but she had to cancel because of some logistic issues, family issues that she's confronting right now. Hopefully I can represent some of her points of view, which I know quite well. Okay, so the issue of drug trafficking and organized crime in Venezuela has been around for a long time. No, it's been something that we've written on for years, and Insight Crime has covered for years. But it really, Geoff and I's interest in this really came to a peak last year during the negotiation process. No, from May through August, there was a negotiation process that was led by Norwegian diplomats. And during this time, the most important or the most sort of complicating factor that was frequently forwarded by those who did not support negotiations, who thought that they were misguided, was precisely this idea of the mafia state, of the narco state, of organized crime, that this is something that, just impeded any kind of negotiation, the success of negotiation. The logic of this, of course, is that if you have politicians whose minds are really on illicit income, not just political power or not just their legacy, it just makes it much harder, because they essentially have another log in the fire. Yeah, then they have ulterior motives, and they don't necessarily want things to change because they have the stream of illicit income. And so Geoff and I decided to look at this. One of the sort of most debilitating elements of the discussion on Venezuela is the tendency to think that Venezuela is completely without precedent, that this is something that never has happened before, which of course is true. No, every human situation, everything human has never actually happened before. Every moment is absolutely unique if you look at it close enough. But if you take a little distance, oftentimes you can see patterns in human conduct and understand them. And that's kind of what we wanted to do, is sort of think about this in a larger context. Then Geoff got a line in on some of the data that was used in this report, and Geoff is very much the first author on this report and put this together, and we sort of sculpted it into something that could address this issue of the narco state in particular, and whether this, and how to think about this in terms of negotiation. So what we're going to do now is we'll start with Geoff, who can sort of talk about the report and his thoughts about this since it was released 10 days ago. And then we'll go to Jeremy and then end with Bram Ibis. Go ahead, Geoff.
Great, thanks so much, David. So I actually have a couple slides that I'm gonna share. So I'm gonna make sure you all can see my computer. You guys should be seeing it now, correct?
Yep.
Great, okay. Yeah, so before we launch into a discussion on the reality of organized crime and corruption in Venezuela and what its implications are for the political crisis there, I just wanted to go through really quickly some of our main findings in the report that you mentioned, David. Last week, some of those who are watching may know that we published a new report that looks at the realities of drug trafficking and corruption in Venezuela using official U.S. government data on transnational cocaine shipments to gauge the scale and relative importance of Venezuela's role as a transit country for cocaine from 2012 to mid-2019. And the reason we put this out, as David touched on, is because we wanted to focus on the reality of corruption and drug trafficking in Venezuela and put it into scale. We work with civil society organizations on the ground in Venezuela that understand that the most realistic way to a transition is through some kind of political accord that leads to new elections. And we have been very supportive of efforts to achieve a peaceful, democratic solution to the crisis, even as so far they've yet to bear fruit. And this idea has gained traction from moderates in the political opposition in Venezuela, as well as some moderates in Chavismo. This paved the way for important negotiations mechanisms in the past year, like the talks that began in Oslo and moved to Barbados and ended in August of last year, and then the current talks that are ongoing to name a new electoral authority that can oversee free and fair elections in the country. But in the course of our work on this, what we found is that our partners in Venezuela that are supportive of a peaceful democratic solution regularly sort of find themselves undercut by political actors in Venezuela and in the US who argue that a political solution in Venezuela is impossible and that the only solution should involve some kind of military intervention. And frequently, these political actors will point to drug trafficking through Venezuela to the United States, basically invoking the case of Manuel Noriega in Panama. There's been a couple examples of this. Most recently, we saw a senior Trump administration official claim that this was in February in a call with reporters that Venezuela is a narco state that has become a primary point of narcotics trafficking to Central America, Mexico, and therefore the United States. As we demonstrate in our report, this is factually incorrect. U.S. data suggests that Venezuela is not a primary transit country for U.S.-bound cocaine. But these calls, they've also been around and have been echoed by minority hardline opposition voices who frequently undercut efforts to achieve a meaningful negotiated solution. We saw a really public letter from this hardline opposition wing last summer that really dealt a serious blow to negotiations efforts last year. So with this in mind, we wanted to take a look at what U.S. government data actually says, and we do this in an environment in which these political actors often seek media attention that exaggerates or overemphasizes the role of Venezuela as a transit country for cocaine bound to the United States. So we were able to obtain U.S. government data on transnational cocaine shipments through Venezuela from the U.S. Southern Command. We got access to cocaine trafficking data, both in terms of metric tons and cocaine trafficking events from maritime, aerial, and other events in both Colombia and Venezuela from 2012 through the end of June 2019. And this is all data from the Interagency Consolidated Counter-Drug Database. There's a lot of intelligence sources that go into this database. It's not just seizures or interdictions data, it's satellite data, it's law enforcement intelligence data. The Department of Defense has regularly held up this database as sort of the best available authoritative source of U.S. government data on cocaine trends, cocaine trafficking trends in our hemisphere. And we've also supplemented the CCDB data with public reports and presentations from DEA, DOD, Department of State, and elsewhere. So what does the data actually say? If you look at our report, you'll find it on WOLA.org. We've pasted the data values that we've received in an annex at the end of our report, and I encourage everyone to look through it. As you can see here, in 2018, the last full year that we received data for, about 210 metric tons of cocaine passed through Venezuela in 2018, and these are, I should say, this is CCDB data for all cocaine events. This is not just for U.S. bound cocaine, but this is all cocaine trafficking flows through Venezuela and through Colombia for the time period studied. And in 2018, as I said, that looked like about 210 metric tons of cocaine through Venezuela. And just to put this in perspective, the State Department reports that about 6 times as much cocaine, or about 1,400 metric tons, passed through Guatemala the same year. Another interesting data point is that Colombian authorities in 2018 reported seizing 273 tons of cocaine that same year. So basically, Colombia seized more metric tons of cocaine than the U.S. government estimates flowed through Venezuela in the entire year of 2018. And this pairs very well with what we know about the transnational cocaine trade in the Americas. This is from the DEA threat assessment of 2018. This is 2017 data. If you go back here, you'll see 2017 was a peak year for cocaine trafficking through Venezuela. And in 2017, the DEA has reported that about 93% of all U.S.-bound cocaine was trafficked through the Western Caribbean and Eastern Pacific routes, so not through Venezuela's Eastern Caribbean seas. If we look at trends, there was certainly an increase in cocaine flows through Venezuela from 2012 to 2017, which corresponded with a surge in cocaine production in Colombia during the same time. And we see that when cocaine trafficking in Colombia dropped slightly post-2017, cocaine flows in Venezuela fell as well. We see that the CCDB data shows that cocaine flows through Venezuela fell about 13% from 2017 to 2018. And because this is data from January to June 30th of 2019, we don't have the full year data for last year. But if we, just assume that it was the same rate in the second half of the year as it was in the first half of the year, we can assume that this downward trend of cocaine flow through Venezuela fell slightly through mid-2019. So while overall cocaine flow through Venezuela decreased, and we can see this here through, this is the same data, but basically this is flow in metric tons, and this is cocaine events. Basically, specific events of cocaine trafficking, either maritime or aerial or other forms of cocaine trafficking events in the time period discussed. But so while the overall cocaine flow through Venezuela dropped, What's interesting is that in the last several years, and this issue has gotten a lot of attention, is that the share of cocaine flow through Venezuela that is aerial traffic, meaning small drug flights through Venezuela to Central America, Mexico, and elsewhere, that share has increased. It's now about 50% of the total cocaine flow, which is about where it was in 2012, but you can see it's increased significantly since 2016, 2017. I think this is an issue that deserves more study, but I do think it's not surprising considering that Venezuela's exports have plummeted since U.S. financial sanctions were first imposed in 2017. So if you're a drug trafficker looking to move product in bulk, it's getting harder and harder to rely on shipping, masking your product in shipping containers through Venezuela. So you turn to an increase in small drug flights. So, I mean, that's my hypothesis for why this share is increasing, but it's definitely worth further study. Another caveat here is that the U.S. is obviously not the only market for cocaine. There's also the European market. Venezuela has historically been a significant transit country for the European market. There's been some interesting reports very recently suggesting that Brazil may have displaced Venezuela as a more relevant transit country to the European markets. There was a Reuters piece that actually came out yesterday looking at customs data from Spain, Germany, and all of the EU. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an issue that does deserve more thought. But the existing data does suggest that Venezuela may be decreasing in importance as a transit country to the EU in the last few years. So all of that to say, drug trafficking and organized crime and state penetration by organized criminal groups are very much a reality in Venezuela. It's a serious problem. It's not just drug trafficking, it's involvement in illicit mining, it's corruption through state contracts, you name it. But I think we need to think very clearly about what implications this all has for a peaceful democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela. Our report looks at the scale of U.S.-bound drug trafficking through Venezuela because it's because of the availability of U.S. data. I think clearly there are credible reports of widespread corruption in the Venezuelan government. And I think we need to treat those seriously. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to have this event and get our report out there, was to encourage more nuanced discussion about the level of centralization, of state centralization and involvement in drug trafficking in Venezuela. But I do think it's important to put this into context as well. I think there's this tendency that David mentioned to argue that if Venezuela is a narco state, or if there's widespread corruption and state penetration by criminal groups in the Venezuelan government, any kind of negotiated transition is impossible. And I think that's historically inaccurate. I think it ignores the fact that there was widespread corruption in the Southern Cone dictatorships. Unearthed intelligence documents have proven that Brazil's military dictatorship turned a blind eye by governors and high-level figures in the security forces. Pinochet embezzled millions. And, the Argentine junta actually purchased a game in the 1978 World Cup. They paid off the other team to boost morale at home. Despite all of this, authoritarian governments yielded to careful international pressure and diplomacy and underwent peaceful transitions to democracy. I also think a useful comparative case here to think about is what happened after the coup in 2009 in Honduras. U.S. policymakers looking at Venezuela today should consider what happened in Honduras after the ouster of Manuel Zelaya. This led to the establishment of an interim interim government that ruled for 7 months and whose legitimacy was contested by significant sectors of the population. During that time, there was widespread unrest, violence, and instability, which led to an explosion of criminal networks deepening their penetration of state institutions. And it's created the environment for drug trafficking and organized crime to flourish in Honduras in a wave of which we are still seeing the effects today. So all that to underscore the need for a peaceful democratic solution in Venezuela as the most realistic way of actually addressing the problem of corruption and organized crime in Venezuela. We've talked a lot about this as WOLA. I encourage you all to look at the recommendations in our report. But among our recommendations are that the U.S. needs to think more clearly about how to pair existing pressure with sought-after outcomes, being more explicit in linking sanctions relief to a negotiated electoral solution. So far, the U.S. has said that there can be no free and fair elections with Maduro in the presidential office, or even perhaps in the country, regardless of the presence of international observers or electoral conditions and things like that. And we think that's a mistake, that focusing on Maduro is a red herring, that really the US and the international community need to be thinking more specifically about electoral conditions and how to pair sanctions relief with verifiable guarantees on the ground. Also, the U.S. Doesn't have to wait until after a transition to address issues of corruption. I understand that AID is conducting really important oversight of its assistance to members of the National Assembly and civil society in Venezuela. And I think it's a really important trend that should be leveraged to pave the way for really much needed judicial reforms in any kind of post-transition Venezuela. And finally, I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Venezuela is not a major cocaine producing country. It's a transit country. The cocaine that's trafficked through Venezuela comes from Colombia. And I think the United States really needs to encourage the Colombian government to fully implement the peace accords and really commit to a sustainable approach to coca cultivation in Colombia that moves beyond sort of aerial spraying and these kind of quick fixes that don't actually address economic factors on the ground. So I'll leave it there. I know I'm probably over time, but thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to a really good discussion on this.
Okay, thank you, Geoff. That was excellent. Okay, now we're going to go to Jeremy McDermott. We can't hear you. I think your mic is turned off still.
How's that? Can we hear me okay?
Right, there we go. Yep, there we go.
Thanks for the invite. Very important topic. So if I understand the paper correctly, the hypothesis is that while 210 tons of cocaine passed through Venezuela in 2018, it's not a primary transit nation or a narco state, and it's unhelpful to describe it as such, as this complicates the search for a negotiated political solution to the current crisis. I'd like to start by looking at the narco issue and the cocaine issue. We don't have access to the CCDB numbers that Geoff has laid out. We have our own. We've got a big team in Venezuela. We're doing a lot of field research, obviously not at the moment. We've got at least 400 tons going through Venezuela. I'm not clear if the CCDB figures include the transit that's going to Brazil, West Africa, and Europe, because most of that, of course, is not traveling through the Caribbean. Brazil is the second biggest consumer of cocaine and its derivatives in the world. It's also the principal bridge to Europe. We've got just along the border, Colombia is producing the most conservative estimate, 350 tons of cocaine. That's literally along the border. And of course, we believe that the vast majority of that is going into Venezuela. It's not crossing the country and going out of the Pacific. Some may be moving up to the Caribbean coast, but resistance in Colombia is such that you don't really want to be moving drugs within country. You want to get them outside as fast as you can. The Catatumbo, for example, on the border is producing 230 tons on its own. So I think the 210 tons, it simply doesn't work for us. We have got John Cuarenta, one of the ex-FARC mafia or FARC dissidents, sat in Amazonas. He and his partners on the Colombian plains that border Venezuela, we think are moving 120 tons on their own into the state of Amazonas, at the bottom of the country on the tri-border area with Brazil, and a lot of that's going into the Brazilian market, an alliance they have with the Red Command group. Now, the important thing, if we want to discuss narco states or not, is not just how many kilos of cocaine are passing through the country, but what are the earnings to national organized crime, in this case Venezuelan organized crime, for every kilo that passes through the country, and what percentage of that is it of gross domestic products. Now, we're going to use our 400 tons. At the moment, let's take an example. The Dominican Republic costs about $1,500 a kilo to transit through the DR. Venezuela is much cheaper, between $250 and $500 a kilo to move your cocaine through Venezuela, put it on a plane, or put it on a boat, one of the go-fast boats leaving Falcon or Sucre, or going to Suriname or Guyana, both of whom are extremely important in the cocaine pipeline. We've had a submarine appear in Spain, which left from the Guyanese coast. A submarine was captured in Suriname last year with 3 Colombians. All of this stuff is crossing Venezuela and going into neighboring countries. So if we work, and this is just back of the napkin estimates, but it does help us kind of frame our analysis. If we agree there's 400 tons, and you may not agree, but that's the number we'll stand by, and we take an average between $250 and $500, which is the toll passing through Venezuela, Venezuela would then be earning $150 million. That would be Venezuelan organized crime. Of course, Venezuelan organized crime isn't just facilitating. Venezuelan organized crime now own some of the shipments. They're no longer just letting the Colombians wander through. They are buying and selling their own shipments. So if we do the exercise again, we've got 400 tons of cocaine. The price of a kilo of cocaine in Central America or the Dominican Republic at the moment is about $7,000 to $8,000. So that means that Venezuelan organized crime could be earning, and you can buy your kilo of cocaine in Venezuela for about $3,000. So Venezuelan organized crime could be earning as much as $4,000 a kilo. That takes us to over $1 billion in earnings for Venezuelan organized crime. Now, it's 1.6 actually. Now, of course, the real figure is somewhere between those two. And if we take the IMF's figure of Venezuelan gross domestic product at 2019 at around $70 billion, $1.6 billion, fairly hefty, but certainly not qualifying as narco state status. I'm a bit surprised that the CCDB has got cocaine trafficking going down. We've got it going up slightly, not incredibly. Also because cocaine production on the coast has actually gone up in 2019. And Venezuela today, more than at any time in its history, is relying more and more on hard currency from the illicit economies. I think what we need to do is just change the narrative in a different way and not focus on drug trafficking. Our position has always been that Venezuela isn't a narco state, it's a mafia state which is managing a variety of different criminal economies. And I'm sure that Bram in a moment is going to be talking about gold, which for us is the principal criminal economy at the moment. Historically, the principal criminal economy in Venezuela has been kleptocracy, has been the systematic pillaging of state coffers and the Venezuelan oil wealth by the Bolivarian and the corrupt elements in the Venezuelan regime. The other thing that we need to put front and center when we're going to talk about negotiation and the power structure in Venezuela is one of the few Latin American nations where we have state-embedded organized crime. The model in Latin America is usually non-state actors and criminal entrepreneurs like Colombian and Mexican cartels. Obviously, they're extremely keen to penetrate the state in order to facilitate and protect their businesses, but Venezuela has got state-embedded organized crime, where the vast majority is actually regulated from within the higher echelons of this current regime. So if we're going to talk about a mafia state, let's talk about the criminal economies that are helping to prop up this. We've got gold, number one. We've got drugs, number two. This is not only cocaine, it's also marijuana. And we've been doing a lot of field research in the Caribbean nations. We were in Suriname, we were in Aruba, we were in Curacao. And we're seeing a lot of Colombian marijuana passing through Venezuela and making its way up. We've got human trafficking. Obviously, this is increasing now with the coronavirus. It's increasing with the closed border. So you now can't cross the border into Colombia legally. So, of course, you're having to use the coyote and illegal migrant networks. And, of course, there's always been the smuggling of petrol across the border. At the moment, very much diminished because there's a shortage in countries, I'm sure you know. And then, of course, there's the general smuggling of medicines and foods and everything else, depending on what the needs and the purchasing power. So today, Maduro needs dollars more than he ever has. Sanctions obviously biting on oil. The price of oil has collapsed. And we see that he is making it easier for criminals to act within Venezuela and bring their dollars with them. And I'll go on to that in a little bit more detail in a sec. You say you want to separate rhetoric from reality, but you don't actually give us an idea of what you think the reality is today and where the cocaine trade, or in our case, the variety of different criminal illicit economies fit in. And I'd like to, we all want an orderly and peaceful solution, but we believe that unless you understand the power structure in Venezuela today, you can't actually carry out a negotiation because you don't really understand who you're negotiating with. And we believe that if you do not understand the management and the criminal economies, you cannot understand with whom you are negotiating. The notion is still, and it's an outdated notion, that Venezuela is a praetorian regime, that the military are the principal arbiters of power. We do not believe this is the case today. This was Chavez. Chavez was a former soldier, post-2002 coup. He had a strategic and deliberate policy to take control of the military in the sense that he controlled promotions. And of course, he rewarded people based on loyalty, not on ability. And by the time he died, we had a full praetorian regime in the sense that the military were present in almost all the organs of government and at a very high level. Maduro is not a former soldier. He does not naturally command the loyalty of the military. And we believe he has been systematically seeking to prise military hands off some of the levers of power. And the way he's done this is he has created a new power structure in Venezuela, not based around the military, based around what we're calling a series of political and criminal fiefdoms. And these are being run by state and non-state actors. His fiefdom, if we can take the anecdote a little bit further, let's see him as the medieval king. He sat with his court in Caracas. Caracas, the center of political power, economically hugely important. This is the area he directly controls, and he tries to directly control Zulia, and the main areas where the oil infrastructure are. However, he has delivered, because he can no longer pay the governors and the mayors and the normal disbursement of funds through a traditional government system, he has given parts of the country to his barons. His barons are told, you can take whatever income you can get, legal or illegal, and he's been dishing out gold mines to various governors. You need to keep a lid on political dissent, and you need to push some cash up to me to keep our regime afloat. A great example of this is Freddy Bernal in Táchira. Táchira is not a gold-producing state. It's on the border with Venezuela, with Colombia, excuse me, and sits astride some of the main smuggling routes for gold, for cocaine, for people, for petrol, everything going across Venezuela. And there are tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit economies to be made in Táchira. Freddy Bernal is not the governor of Táchira, he's the protector of Táchira, completely artificial post. And he has been taking control of all the illicit economies in Táchira. He set up his own colectivo, the Colectivo Fronterizo de Seguridad. He's working with the ELN, he's expelled the Rastrojos, and he's beginning to impose a monopoly along the border and scoop up criminal revenues. He is a robber baron answering to this corrupt king in Caracas, who is Maduro. And I think we need to map this power structure today. We need to take into account that the Maduro government is facilitating, protecting, participating, and perhaps even surviving off illicit economies. And this is the only way to understand the current dynamics and therefore successfully negotiate the peaceful political solution that we all want. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. You are right on time. So now we'll move to Bram Ibis. Go ahead, Bram.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm greeting everyone from Bogota in lockdown, and it will be interesting to see how the coronavirus crisis also affects the cocaine trade and the numbers, of course, but I'll leave that up to you. My intervention will be a little bit less cocaine-ish. I will focus a bit more on other illicit economies, on other criminal powerhouses, basically also focusing in on topics Jeremy already addressed, which is gold mining and the border. But I think first of all, I want to touch upon a few concepts, having been invited to this session on the narco state or the mafia state, which honestly are two terminologies I'm not really fond of and which I also won't be using. I prefer to look more into what Venezuela represents in terms of a deep corruption and a kleptocracy. When we're speaking about kleptocracies, we're basically looking at states that aim to maximize their personal profits or the profits of a very small group of people in the same way that a commercial undertaking does to do as well, and its responsibility a company, for example, has to its shareholders is maybe the same responsibility the government of Venezuela has to non-state armed groups and criminal organizations that are related to the government, or some other groups that give political capital to the government, which I see as the shareholders of the Maduro government. In a kleptocracy, of course, what a state or what a very small elite group of politicians does is ransack or plunder a country, right? These revenues translate in political power, often go hand in hand with criminal activities or activities of criminal groups. In this sense, what we also see in Venezuela is that these criminal or non-state armed groups and the government share the same goal, which is profit making. So the difference between these criminal organizations and the government slowly starts to fade, identifying a similar modus operandi. Venezuela, being a kleptocracy, finds itself in an excellent position, having an abundance of natural resources. This means that the regime has a sustainability until depleting all these resources and looking at the oil reserves, the gold reserves, and other possibilities for other economies. That's a very long time. This also means that Venezuela doesn't really depend on its citizenry or people paying taxes to the government, because they get their revenues from resource exploitation, which makes it fairly undemocratic and also disenfranchises the population, because no one really knows how much these illegal revenues are that the government is receiving. Other examples, for example, to look at, maybe also to step away from Central American examples, is, for example, kleptocracies in Uganda during the reign of Idi Amin, and in Liberia during George Taylor. And if we look at Venezuela, we see one of the most by crime penetrated nations in the world, and we see that the state is very inefficient, inept, or unwilling to really provide services as security, public utilities, and regulation of sectors which are of economic importance, such as mining. But we also see that the government highly depends on these illicit economies, and I think Jerry made a very good point, that the government needs hard currency now to survive, especially foreign currencies. And because of the sanctions, it's very hard to trade, to import, export, to basically get this revenue stream into the country, being the government. So this is why the government in certain sectors increasingly depend on illicit economies and black markets or international partners, where they're able to sell their high valued commodities, such as gold, other minerals, or drugs. So I think that the sanctioning regime in general pushes the government to a black market looking for dollars. But especially speaking about gold, we've also seen that the sanctioning of the gold sector basically informalized the trade even more than that it was, and that more of the gold is flowing over illicit routes to be subsequently legalized in other countries with false paperwork, and then reaches in international markets. So it makes it all very more opaque and much more hard to control, and gives parts of the government and parts of civil society also no other options than access these black markets, right? So what we also see, and what also basically resonated in the other presentations today, is that we maybe must step away of the idea that the crisis in Venezuela is a political crisis, where we have two actors on the battlefield, which is the Chavista government and which is the opposition. What we see now is that a lot of sovereignty is lost in Venezuela to non-state armed groups and criminal actors that basically adopted the functions of the state. So we can speak about a lot of proto-states in the country, where these non-state actors exercise justice, create social bases, work in education, pay for healthcare, but also control regions with a very strong violent hand, right? This basically means that the government isn't in control over these regions, which at the moment is not the biggest problem for stability, because there are tacit alliances between these groups and the government. So these groups have no natural enemy in the government and vice versa. But if there is a change of government or a change of regime, these alliances can be tossed upside down and can break, which means that we will enter a very violent scenario in Venezuela, where these groups need to defend what's theirs already. looking at the loss of sovereignty, for me, it's always most interesting to look at the Colombian border and the southern regions of Venezuela, because we see most non-state armed presence, the biggest upsurge of illicit economies. So let me first try to briefly address mining. Venezuela is living a very, very explosive mining boom, which not so much has to do with a rise of commodity prices, but absolutely is related to the crisis in Venezuela and the necessity of accessing dollars, which will be paid for gold if you get it over the borders, but also of it relates to unemployment and many people going from the urban centers to the mining regions in the south, and also relates to criminal organizations also leaving the urban centers, knowing that there are more profit-making opportunities in the south and in the border regions. In these mining regions, we see that local populations, and especially indigenous populations, have no other choice than to partake in illicit mining or line up with non-state armed groups, because gold has become the currency. For example, you pay with a gram of gold for your drinks, you pay for your where you rent your room, you pay for basically everything. So you need to partake in this economy, but also because of destruction of the environment, many indigenous groups, depending historically on ancestral agriculture, need to align with mining gangs, because there's no way they can fend for themselves anymore. So if we go back to the issue of the kleptocracy or the criminal state, we must understand whether the revenues of the gold is actually trickling up to the highest government circles, which is a very difficult argument to make, although we have a lot of information. So there is no definitive evidence yet that Maduro or the most senior government officials receive payments in gold, but it is crystal clear that local authorities, government loyalists, and senior army officials reap the extra legal benefits from mining. Maybe to explain a bit how this works, is that the non-state armed groups, but also the army, control illicit mining economies. And what basically happens is that commissions in gold or mineral ore are paid to these groups or to these army officials. We have percentage of in between 30% of the gold production up to 80% of the gold production, which is reported. And from there on and up, it basically trickles up to the higher echelons, right? We know, for example, the governors on Bolívar state and Amazonas state are receiving the commanders of the Zodi, which is a regional defense group of the military, are receiving their parts. And of course, this is very interesting statement that the governors each will receive a gold mine, which kind of amuses me, knowing that all these gold mines are in control by very violent non-state armed groups, and they really won't permit the governor showing up with a suitcase to collect his gold from these mines. So I think it has to crystallize how this works, but I think this was more a promise to inside loyalty, right? What we also see in military circles is that they have stakes in gold processing plants and are involved in different parts of the supply chain, which can be taking care of that cyanide reaches the plants, that mercury reaches the mines, but they're also involved in getting explosive and mining hardware and fuel, and especially taxing the fuel is a very important secondary informal economy related to mining. And we know that the army actively participates and facilitates trafficking routes to all the respective borders of Venezuela. Another interesting number by the Venezuelan NGO Control Ciudadana by Rosa San Miguel is that they identified 15 most common illicit economies in Venezuela, and the army is partaking in all these 15 informal or illicit economies. What we also know is that there's one big state mining company called Minerven. They are running operations since many decades already, but what we also know is that they're barely or not even producing any gold right now. But meanwhile, Venezuela, which is not a historic mining country, in 7 years started to produce more gold than Colombia is producing, which is a historic mining country. So the mining boom has been enormous. We have some estimates, but we haven't been able to verify them thoroughly enough to be able to share them in a setting like this. But we know it's a lot. We know that trafficking routes often went to the Dutch Caribbean. We have the numbers of Curaçao and Aruba, and they're astonishing. But Aruba and Curaçao now blocked these routes. July last year, but we know it's still going through there, but that the gold is increasingly taken to the southern countries and to Colombia, where it's subsequently legalized or trafficked to international destinations, often using recognized airlines such as American Airlines, such as KLM. And we know that there's still really a lot of Venezuelan gold reaching US markets. What we also know is that, going back to Minervan, the state company, which is an official seller to the Venezuelan central bank, and they have been one of the biggest exporters to international destinations from Venezuela, although the sanctions make it very difficult now. So what happens? Minervan doesn't produce gold. They get all the gold from mines controlled by non-state armed actors, which includes Favrot dissidents, ELN, Venezuelan organized crime, most commonly known in the mining regions as sindicatos. We also know that the mega banda, El Tren de Aragua, increased its presence in the mining areas and is controlling actively the mines. And all this gold is funneled to Minervan, then goes to the Venezuelan central bank, and then will be flown to international buyers, for example, in Turkey, in the Emirates, in Switzerland. But it's often very difficult to relate this gold with the mining conflicts going on in the southern parts of the country, because it's also possible that the gold sold by the central bank is just stockpile gold or bullion. The symbiotic relationship between the state and local criminal actors in the mining areas basically explains that there are many revenues being reaped by government and especially army officials, but it's always hard to say how far up this goes, right? But I completely agree with Jeremy that gold is basically the lifeline of Venezuela right now in many senses. And if we see what's going on in these mines, speaking about torture, massacres, a lot of disappearances, and that the gold is maintaining all these groups, it completely enables us to speak about conflict resources, and international actors should treat Venezuelan gold as a conflict mineral. This doesn't mean that sanctioning regimes is the way to go, but especially concerning gold, this has been highly ineffective, but it definitely must remain on the agenda. Knowing the financial breadth it gives to many actors in Venezuela, I think the southern parts, all the non-state armed groups present in the south, should be treated with absolute urgency, also trying to approach Venezuela with policy recommendations, possible new phases of negotiations. It should be on the agenda. If not, I think most initiatives will prove to fail in the future. Not sure how much time is left, but I'm going to quickly switch to the border right now, because in the border we see similar scenarios with a complete loss of sovereignty, with more presence of non-state armed actors that are controlling most of the border with Colombia, Venezuela, which is a border of over 2,200 kilometers. We know that these groups are in charge and gain hefty sums of money by taxing passage, taxing goods, and operating trafficking networks. We know that these groups are basically enabled by the public forces, especially the Venezuelan army, to operate these roads. And of course, there's a kickback of money to these to the Venezuelan army. But these relations are very volatile, and I think that's speaking about a criminal state reaping benefits from illegal border controls and charging for crossing over these borders must be analyzed in a very local setting, because all these alliances are in the region, which can be, for example, Colombian guerrilla with a local army commander, Colombian paramilitaries with the Venezuelan customs, and these local power dynamics do not reflect necessarily the official stance of Caracas and Venezuelan politics towards these armed groups. This is basically a very local agreement, often though permitted by Caracas. But these agreements are very volatile, and we know that often clashes between Venezuelan armed forces and local groups have occurred and will continue to occur, and also must be taken into account when assessing illicit economies and criminal states, because the alliance is very fracturable, which has happened and will continue to happen. Maybe to finish really quick, these bribes that guardsmen, policemen are taking on the border and often share with illicit armed groups is oftentimes also because of an order from above. I've spoken with defected Venezuelan National Guardsmen in Brazil who basically were ordered to collect money on the border, and they needed to give their superior $2,000 each week. So they were given the incentive or the obligation to actually collect these revenues. And to finish with, maybe it's a country that quickly could relapse into conflicts over border control and over resources, which not only contributes to the financial empowerment of these non-state armed groups, but also continues to generate and sustain corruption in the armed forces, which I think is a very important point to not forget. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bram. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask each of you a question sort of that emerged from your presentation. I'm going to go in reverse order, starting with Bram, and then with Jeremy, and then with Geoff. And the question will be on your presentation. Then I'll let each of you, after I give the three questions, I'll let each of you respond for a couple of minutes. And please feel free to respond not only to your question, but to the question I give to the other presenters, or if you have another comment to that you want to add, given the flow of the presentations, that's fine as well. Okay, so Bram, thank you. It's super interesting and really amazing the work that you've been doing on gold in Venezuela. It's really almost unimaginable how you've been able to do this field work. I think the master question that we have in this symposium, and that really guides our look at this issue, is this issue of negotiations. Does this prevent a negotiated settlement? Does this prevent a negotiated political settlement? And so when you look at it that way, I kind of think of these different illicit activities in two different ways. I think on the one hand, there are activities, for example, drug trafficking, and as well as corruption, as well as the food corruption and whatnot, that are illicit activities that basically function to sort of fill the pockets of officials and the people that they work with. And I think those activities provide a really strong ulterior motive that sort of prevents a negotiated settlement. I think, if they reach a certain dimension, without a doubt, that has an impact. Now, I think of gold as a little bit more like, commercializing oil without, in ships, sort of skirting sanctions and commercializing oil in ships without transponders. I mean, these are activities that are illicit and they're problematic in their own right. But really what they do is they end up replacing revenues for the government. That seems to be in a somewhat different category for me. It seems to me that in itself would not be a strong causal force that would prevent any kind of negotiated settlement. So I would just wonder if you could tell us what you think about that logic, if you see it that way, if you see it differently. From Jeremy, I have a question. Actually, I have two questions for Jeremy. One was sort of the most striking thing about your presentation was how different your data is from the CCDB. And if you could just tell us a bit about your methodology, what you could tell us. I'm sure some of it is somewhat sensitive, but what you can tell us that can give us a feel for your project and where your information comes from, I think would be helpful. I was looking at some of your articles, and I try to read everything that Insight Crime publishes on Venezuela. The issue of the Cartel de los Soles is something that I've followed since the time that emerged. And I think in your series of pieces on the mafia state, you say quite clearly there that, well, the Cartel de los Soles is not actually a cartel. It doesn't really, the metaphor doesn't actually work. And I think, my friend Javier Mallorca said it quite well several years back when he called it an urban legend, And so, and the reason it doesn't work is that it's not actually articulated the way a cartel is. I mean, the name cartel, you think of a clearly articulated network of agreements and actors. And so in that same vein, I'm wondering if the idea of a mafia state actually works. Mafia, you think of as a mafia family, you think of some sort of coherent organization. Oftentimes it even has an ideology, and it has very articulated network and forms of communication. It has a whole. So is it useful to think of the Venezuelan state in that way? And I should say here, I should give a hat tip to Veronica Zubillaga, because this is this idea comes from a presentation she gave last year at LASA in Boston at the Latin American Studies Association meetings, in which she said, well, the most recent research on crime in the past 10, 15 years actually portrays crime not as an issue of state capacity like it was portrayed in the 1990s, but rather an issue of crime being embedded in states, that states are involved in crime, are main actors in crime. And so, saying that Venezuela is a mafia state both distinguishes it from the region in a way that's probably not accurate, and probably is a little bit false to the phenomenon in the sense that what's really going on is there's all kinds of different disparate networks of crime that in the end, won't really prevent any kind of negotiation simply because they're not articulated. And then finally for Geoff, you sort of broached this, and we mentioned it in the report. If you could say a little bit about, the issues of a transition. What do you think this means in terms of a negotiated transition? And I know there's been some really interesting work by people like Guillermo Trejo who have looked at, different types of transition, how sustainable they are, and basically show really sort of have to address these issues of criminal networks to have a sustainable transition. On the other hand, if you do that, it makes it that much more difficult. And so your thoughts on in the case of Venezuela, what you think this means in terms of negotiation and what any kind of transition could be. So let's just start with Bram. And as I mentioned, feel free to respond to my question or the question I gave to other people or any other issue.
So maybe to get back to the question about a negotiated solution in the light of all this loss of sovereignty and all these criminal and non-state-owned players. So I think at a certain moment you get to the question, who should you actually negotiate with? Assuming that a lot of power in Caracas has been handed over to other groups. And I think this actually could provide the region with a very interesting opportunity of resuming the idea of having conversations with what now is a very significant actor in Venezuela, which is the Colombian guerrilla ELN, which actually blew up its own rounds of dialogue with the Colombian state quite literally last year in January. And I think that the ELN, for example, is a group that doesn't identify with the Bolivarian revolution, but has a lot of sympathy for the government in Caracas and was able to broker its own kinds of agreements with the state, knowing that, for example, the FARC, the other Colombian guerrilla group, now dissident group, has a much stronger relationship to the Chavistas. But I think that we should see the ELN as a problem for the whole region, knowing that they're active in different countries and up their game significantly in Venezuela. So they're not using Venezuela anymore as just a rear guard, but it has basically become a very strong base for them. And also seeing that they are recruiting many people, investing time and finances into educational projects, bases, involving locals in whatever that they're doing, and also that they're asking less commissions in gold mining regions, especially less than other actors. We know that they're basically there for other reasons than only the economic incentive, and they're there to stay. So I think it's making or brokering new agendas for next rounds of negotiations should absolutely involve taboo issues such as the presence of the Colombian guerrilla, which should be on the first page of the agenda. And I think it's actually a very cool opportunity to tackle this issue through an approach in different countries. But of course, it will be very hard to negotiate the ELN with the government, if current government in Caracas, if not impossible. And honestly, the same goes for the current government in Colombia, seeing their attitudes towards the peace deal with the FARC, their attitude towards the ELN in general. Also, negotiations should look at the environment in general, I think so. There's this concept about environmental security, which very much applies to Venezuela, knowing that most of the criminal actors not only destroy the environment by their modus operandi, but also benefit from the environment, and especially conflict resources. So one way to tackle these non-state armed groups, to tackle the loss of sovereignty by the state, is looking actually what's going on with the environment, and how do we break the link between the conflict resources and these non-state armed groups. And this is where you can speak about what do we have, because Venezuela has no official certified studies about gold reserves, environmental capital, etc. And possibly as well, if the country wants to diversify economically, it should look at other opportunities economic-wise. Not anything the environment provides Venezuela with many of these chances, and it should be on the agenda to basically look at who is illegally benefiting from the environment, what do we have, what are other possible economies that could be used for employment generation, that could be used for environmental protection, and also constitutionally must be determined by indigenous communities living in these areas who absolutely lost their voice when the armed government came running in. So I think that these discussions about environment and what it can mean for Venezuela could actually be an icebreaker and negotiations between opposition and government, and could be a different approach to bring people together and speak about something they actually have in common, which is future ideas for how to develop projects in southern Venezuela, and could be something original to try different this time. So I think that all these issues of non-state armed groups, environmental conflicts, conflict resources, of course, make negotiations very much more difficult, but also provide new windows of opportunity to get people together to discuss possible solutions for the future of Venezuela.
Thank you. Jeremy?
Okay, to start with your methodological question, David, it's all through field research. We always try and build everything from the ground upwards. On the production side of cocaine, we're obviously looking at the White House and the UNODC figures, and then we're going onto the ground and speaking to the coca farmers to see how many kilos they're getting from their hectare over the course of the year, which is why we think the production actually along the Venezuela border is anything up to 500 tons. Of course, there's seizures and all other bits and pieces. And then we've been spending a lot of time in Venezuela. We've got people there. Obviously, we're not going to identify them, and we're in and out the whole time. We specialize, as you probably know if you read the site, on profiling the criminal groups themselves. And looking at their criminal portfolios and how they survive, their leadership structures, their territorial control. So we've been doing a lot of this with the colectivos, with the FARC and the ELN within, or the ex-FARC mafia and the ELN within Venezuela, the Rastrojos Bolivarianos, the other small Colombian groups, the FBL, and trying to map these actors. And then perhaps the hardest bit is trying to link them to political power, to develop this notion that there is now a fusion between political and criminal power through a variety of irregular or non-state actors, many of whom now operate with state blessing and indeed with ID cards, like some of the colectivos, which of course blurs the line increasingly between the two. The mafia state thing, well, you have to remember, David, that paper was written 2 years ago. What is still relevant from that is the Venezuelan state does not confront organized crime or transnational organized crime. It does protect and facilitate it, and it does participate in it in a variety of different ways. So that is still the case. The cartel of the Suns, of course, dates back to more than 20 years when the National Guard had the monopoly on border control, and they were the ones charging for the crossing of cocaine into Venezuela. That monopoly is now gone. That monopoly, the military, if you remember, in one of the many crises, Chavez militarized the frontier and gave various different operational zones to army officers Therefore, they began to get involved in this charging. We've got the CICPC doing it. Well, of course, today, the Cartel of the Suns is even less relevant as a term, because while the military is involved in almost every criminal activity, much of it, the mining and the cocaine and others, is being run by non-state actors. So we're journalists, so we do like the odd sexy name like Cartel of the Suns. And it does have a use in the sense that the military are still extremely important players if you want to understand transnational organized crime activities in Venezuela.
Okay, Geoff? Thank you.
I'll try to be quick because I know there's questions on Twitter. The question of what it means for a transition. I think there's no question that the state of organized crime and corruption in Venezuela has implications for the political crisis. I think the short-term and long-term implications. I think in the short term, this is true of the transitions in the Southern Cone. It's unlikely that we'll get to a democratic transition in Venezuela without some kind of pacted agreement with the existing power structure. And in Chile, for instance, that meant cutting a deal with the military and giving them, a set percentage of the state copper industry, as well as permanent seats in the legislature. I think in Venezuela, I do think that any kind of political agreement is going to have to provide some kind of guarantees. I think the issue of extradition will factor in. I think if you are someone who's been named as having links to the drug trade and drug shipments to the United States, I think your exit costs invariably go up, and we saw this play out around the Colombian peace process. I mean, I say this not to make a generalized blanket call for impunity. Obviously, we want to see a return to democracy in Venezuela that upholds principles of justice and rule of law. But I do think that there's good best practices that we can look to. In the Colombian peace process, for instance, we saw this issue tackled through the idea of alternative sentencing. So the idea that members of the FARC, for instance, could see differentiated sentences through a specialized transitional justice system. That may be a model we're studying in Venezuela. But those are the short-term implications. I mean, I think the long-term implications are that corruption is just not going to go away overnight. I mean, there is this almost fantastical idea that the problem with Venezuela is the people at the top. And if you just get rid of Maduro and his cúpula, then the corruption in Venezuela is just going to vanish. And that's just not realistic. I mean, we saw this, the best case to compare it to is in Guatemala. We saw a transition after the end of the Guatemalan armed conflict. And that did nothing to affect the existing power structures that had deep links to organized crime, drug trafficking, and grand corruption. In Honduras, recently we saw the same issue addressed through the MAXI, this OAS-backed anti-impunity body in Guatemala. There was the CICIG. Of course, now both of those bodies have seen their mandates expire. But I do think that they're models worth exploring. Are there ways that a post-transition Venezuela can ensure that there is an independent arbiter in place to oversee much-needed judicial reforms?
Okay, thank you all. We're going to go to some Twitter questions that have come in and have made it through the nonsense filter. I'm going to put forward 3 questions, and then you can each have basically 5 minutes. We have 15 minutes left. And so I'll give the three questions, and then you can each answer the question that you like, or make any other comment that you want. And that will probably take us right to about the end of our time. So here's a question from Chris Woody of Business Insider. He asks, based on your findings, what changes would you recommend for the U.S. counter-drug strategy in the region? And here is a question from, it looks like this is from Pre-Cover. I'm not sure exactly what Twitter account this is, but this question is for Bram. It says, but I think anybody could answer this. In possible future power sharing arrangement, are the non-state armed actors to be included in some way? And then here, finally, this one is from WOLA's own Jimena Sanchez. Says, in parts of Colombia, we see illegal and legal armed groups triaging in the illegal gold mining trade, making it difficult to ascertain who is really running the business and who is being corrupted into it. In Venezuela, is there one group running the business? Okay, so why don't we start with Bram, and then we'll each of you can have 5 minutes. Your microphone.
Maybe to say something really quickly about drug policies in future-wise, I think it's also going to be very interesting and necessary to monitor illicit crop production in Venezuela, which is very tiny, which is very minimal. We don't know a lot about it, but we do know it exists. For example, in Zulia state, but we also know that in Amazonas state, which borders with the Vichan and Guaini department in Colombia, which have been coca-grown departments historically. We know that the bordering Amazonas state in Venezuela is also a very apt region for illicit crop production, and basically no journalists, academics, observers have been able to really penetrate that department because of the inaccessibility logistics-wise, but also because of the complete control by Colombian guerrilla groups. I think it's very important to also monitor whether there's a possibility that Venezuela become a producing actor, or that the status quo concerning production and more being a transit country will remain in place. So to go on to the question about the power sharing arrangement with armed groups, well, I'm honestly happy. I'm not the person who's going to make decisions like that, because it's a very complicated debate, of course. Looking at Colombia, you first need to know, for example, concerning the FARC, what ambitions these groups have. If they would like to have a political party as a spin-off and want to partake in politics, I think that definitely for some actors shouldn't be discarded future-wise. But I think this is not yet the discussion, and approaching non-state armed actors in Venezuela on any agenda of negotiation between political groups basically must try to start with a call for a studied approach, basically calling for, we need to reach out to these actors, we need to identify who they are, what they want, with how many they are, if they pursue a political agenda. And I think also concerning the ELN, the Colombian guerrillas, who were not really open about their presence in Venezuela, there should be a channel of communication with them also to basically know what's their political, military, and social plan for Venezuela, because we don't know. We know they're working on social bases, but we don't know what they actually want. And I think the Venezuelans absolutely deserve to know from them as well, to basically know what's up. So before speaking about power sharing arrangements, there are many steps that need to be taken before to basically know which actors will be significant players, which actors want to claim that they want to be political players, and how to approach it. Then the next question about who, basically the question is who is boss in the gold mining areas in southern Venezuela, and I think it's too early to say. What we've seen, especially in Bolívar state, is that the sindicatos, which are former construction unions from the two major cities in Bolívar states, Puerto Ordaz and Ciudad Bolívar, who outsourced to the mining region in the wake of the collapse of the construction sector, which is of course related to the economic crisis in Venezuela. These sindicatos have been armed and permitted to run the mines by the ex-governor Rangel Gomez, who, of course, charged its commission in gold from these sindicatos. But these sindicatos, because of the hefty mining revenues, financially emancipated and didn't really depend on the state anymore for the weapons supply or for being allowed to run the mines, which caused problems for the current governor, the acting governor Justo Noguera, who wasn't able to control the sindicatos to the same extent as ex-governor Rangel Gomez did. So then we saw that the ELN basically was permitted to advance in Bolivar state, cleanse out sindicatos from certain mines and take control, sometimes very tacitly, of mining areas. But we also saw that the upsurge of the ELN stopped somewhere late 2018, 2019, and that there are some kind of alliance forged between the ELN and local criminal actors who are often subcontracted by them. So before making this any more complicated, there are different actors, there are power struggles ongoing, there are status quo in certain regions, but we definitely know that there is not a single most strongest actor in the mining region, that the alliances are very fragile and volatile. So we can't, it's not a, there is no end game yet. There will be definitely one actor having the ambition of controlling most of the mines, which also can be state or army. But as of now, it's still very fractured, divided, which also makes it very dangerous. It's a very violent region, and knowing that this is a region, the mining areas bordering with Brazil, Guyana, and Colombia, there are also many spillover implications and security issues for all these countries.
Thank you, Bram. Jeremy?
If I may, I'll just address the first two, David. A quick one on US counter-narcotics strategy. I just want to focus on one aspect, which is the likelihood of spraying continuing, starting again here in Colombia, the aerial spraying of drug crops under US pressure. I worry about the collateral damage and the actual effectiveness of this. And it's not just health and environmental of spraying these toxic chemicals over parts of the Amazon people. At the moment, we've got the drug trade or drug production concentrated in a much smaller area than we have for a very, very long time. So more than 60% of coca crops are in just 10 municipalities in the country. This allows the government to increasingly isolate the drug trade and its cancerous effects of violence and human rights abuses, etc., in smaller and smaller areas of the country. As soon as you start spraying, bang, the coca crops will atomize again and spread across many more parts of the country, therefore spreading the cancer, violence, and human rights abuses with it. Secondly, it will probably fatally damage the credibility and legitimacy of the state after these promises that were made as part of the FARC peace process. And it is going to push these communities once again into the arms of the illegal actors, and we're going to see the ex-FARC mafia increase their recruitment and indeed their legitimacy in the eyes of the local communities. So while we will almost certainly see a short drop and significant drop in coca crops, this will very quickly flatten out and they will grow again, and then we will have all these other environmental, social, and human rights problems to deal with. Just a very quickie on the power structure, and can we ignore these non-state armed actors? Absolutely not. Any new government that takes power by whatever means cannot afford to confront all of these different armed actors at the same time. Simply impossible. And I'm not just talking about the FARC and the ex-FARC mafia and the ELN. I'm talking about the colectivos, the FBL, the Frente Francisco Miranda. There are dozens and dozens of these groups. Bram's talked about the sindicatos. We've got the pranes from the prisons and the pranes structures outside the prisons. We've got the mega bandas, Tren de Aragua, and many others. There are literally dozens of these groups. There's only one thing that unites the vast majority of them, and that is anti-US sentiment. And you asked me about, the mafia state and ideology. the Bolivarian ideology is a very powerful cement. And it is a very useful facade for a variety of different official, state and non-state actors to cover and justify their criminal activity. We've seen the ELN working for, 50 years, resisting a US-backed government in Colombia. If a US-backed government takes power in Venezuela, do we think they're not going to resist them? I think that's food for thought and needs to be further analyzed.
Thank you, Jeremy. Geoff?
Yeah, no, I really just want to emphasize what other panelists said. I want to agree very much with what Jerry just said. The idea that we needed the Marines to land, and the only way we can address this narco state is through.
Geoff, could you check your mic? I think we're getting some distortion. I'm not sure if it's your mic or if it's the audio in general, but it started when you started to talk. So just kind of maybe get closer to the mic and try.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yeah, that's better.
Great. No, I think what I'm hearing is the importance to emphasize an orderly, peaceful transition in Venezuela if we actually care about addressing organized crime and armed groups in the country. The idea that some kind of collapse scenario or military intervention in Venezuela will achieve a positive outcome that actually addresses some of these problems is clearly inaccurate. Finally, I want to say on the question of implications for counter-narcotic strategy. I think U.S. strategy needs to be based on reality. If we look at the U.S. government's own best estimates of the total cocaine flow through Venezuela, the reality is Venezuela is not a primary transit country for cocaine flows to the United States. So I think what that means is U.S. officials need to be more responsible in their public communications and back off of statements that are demonstrably false, like saying Maduro is flooding our streets with cocaine and using that to argue against the most realistic outcome, which is a peaceful, pacted transition as the best way of getting at all of this. Second, I think our findings show the limits of traditional supply side focuses on the drug war. I don't know how many more decades we have to go through this to see that no matter how high seizure rates go up, you're not going to get rid of the transnational drug trade unless you treat it through and you analyze it through an economic lens and you look at the incentives faced by those who are most involved in production of illicit substances. Juan Manuel Santos, former Colombian president, has talked about the drug war as the cure being worse than the disease. So I think there are really important implications for U.S. counter-narcotic strategy in the hemisphere. We don't really touch on them in our report. We want to keep things focused on the response to the political crisis and the need for a peaceful, democratic solution as the best way of really getting at the root cause of these issues of corruption and organized crime.
Okay, thank you. I think that this is the time we had allotted, right? Until 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. Yeah, okay. So there's a couple more questions on Twitter, but I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to those. I would like to thank the panelists and thank all those who have watched. We're going to try and take this and put it on the blog so that people can watch it on their own time as well. Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Thanks.